This is the state of Colorado. The state of Colorado is a spontaneous discussion of the issues. Funding for the state of Colorado is provided by the Adolph Coors Foundation, Colorado National Bank, the Monfort Charitable Foundation, and the investment firm of Piper Jaffray and its employees, looking toward the future since 1895. Now, Don Kinney.
Good evening. Coloradans provided mixed messages on Tuesday. Political editor Fred Brown, inconsistency from voters on growth and education. Michael Booth, the fiery leader of an emotional issue of 3 years ago, this week said he wants to go national. He says the group he helped start has a scope which is too narrow. Deborah Frazier, in southwestern Colorado, local businesses await payments they know will never come. A corporation walked away from a mess and its bills. Guy Kelly, quality of life and growth. Ample discussion, limited action. Growth was on Tuesday's ballot in many areas of the state. Fred Brown.
Don, I think when you look at it, there were a lot of issues that had to deal with growth. Everything from the statewide referendum on prisons to a lot of local tax issues on open space and taxes for highways and new prisons. Some places passed those issues, some places didn't.
Why didn't everybody vote the same way?
I think, Don, that doesn't very often happen. But I think there was, if there was a pattern, it was that people, even in Boulder, which has long been growth conscious, did not want to reduce growth to a formula. They have growth limits in effect. They didn't want to say, let's just say it's 1% from here on out. And in other places, it was that people felt that government can grow along with the economy, but it shouldn't grow beyond the economy with new taxes.
Guy Kelly, you cover growth. Why wasn't it consistent?
I think people decided to skirmish with growth this time around instead of wage all-out war. In some places, in El Paso County, for example, the people did speak with one voice. They said no to everything. We're not paying for more prison space or jail cells. We're not paying for the library district. But up the highway in Douglas County, they said, yeah, we need to accommodate growth. It's been tremendous, and we're going to have to make things happen to accommodate all the new people that are here.
And Fred Brown, Governor Romer keeps talking about growth being...
Smart growth,
yes.
You know, I think it is probably very prominent in people's considerations of what they do, how they make their decisions. There is certainly a mentality that Colorado has a very good quality of life as it is, but it could be threatened by more and more people arriving. And they will vote to accommodate some of those things, but they don't want to accommodate too many of the new institutions, the new government agencies that are needed for growth.
And speaking of a government agency, Mike Booth, RTD in a way is growth.
And Don, there's another example of voters not doing what you might have expected them to or being inconsistent, because here you have an agency, RTD, that has had terrible publicity from disputes over racial issues and what to do with light rail, whether to build light rail or not, in and out of the news constantly for the last 6 months. And they had an election where they were asking to de-Bruce, to be given back, to be allowed to keep some of the money, the surplus revenue that they would otherwise have to give back under Amendment 1 from a couple of years ago. Not only for last year, but for the next couple of years. That would give them millions of dollars over the next few years to work with. And the public said, RTD expected them to say no because they lost this issue only a year ago. So now the voters come in and say, well, yes, you can keep it. And they by a pretty significant margin. And the RTD is fairly stunned about it.
53% said, yes, you can keep the money. RTD says, okay, we'll do something with it.
What they're saying now is that within a year, people start to notice some of the changes that they're going to use this money for. They have a new general manager who has a lot of innovative ideas about how he wants to present transportation to people, not just the huge bus running by on a fixed route at a certain time every day. One of the main ideas that will probably appear sometime in the next year are so-called neighborhood circulator buses, which have proven very popular by a different organization up in Boulder that runs on a neighborhood route that is at very popular stops, some cultural centers and some office centers and some popular neighborhood stops, just constantly runs around in a loop. And people know that if they show up at the bus stop fairly soon, a bus will come by. and that he wants to start doing that in some of the suburban neighborhoods and areas of Denver that don't get enough service in that way. Use smaller buses and smaller vans if he needs to do that. So that will start showing up.
The vote yes for RTD was also even a wider margin for the Scientific and Cultural Facilities District.
There you didn't have any management problems to speak of. In fact, you had Klondike and snow, for goodness sakes. I mean, that was very wise of the SCFD 4 years ago or whenever it was to use a polar bear. How did they know? But in the case of the Denver Public Schools, where there was concern about management and no real definite purpose for the increased tax revenue, or nothing really announced except that we'll improve things, voters said no. The RTD had management problems, but it wasn't going to raise taxes. The schools had management problems, and they were going to raise taxes, and that's why one succeeded and the other failed.
Mike Booth.
Schools again were all over the map. You had Denver saying no to a tax increase, but suburban schools saying a definite yes in a lot of cases. Some of the suburban schools said no. But Cherry Creek, and I think it may be a case of how specific they were getting. Cherry Creek said it was going to use the money very specifically for a new high school, a couple of elementary schools, and a middle school. Denver said we're going to implement some reforms over the next year. They were somewhat specific, but I think people were saying, well, we don't know exactly what the money's going for, therefore we're not going to give it to you.
Fred Brown, up at Boulder, voters said rather strongly, no smoking in public places unless the rooms are really well ventilated.
What was it, 55-45, I think was the final vote. I kept track of that all night. And, you know, Boulder was on the internet, so it was actually fairly easy to keep track of Boulder's figures once we discovered that. The Boulder electorate, I think, is a very health conscious kind of electorate, and it used to be a very, or I think still is, a very environmentally conscious kind of electorate, a growth conscious kind of electorate. But the vote on the 1% limitation in residential growth, I think reflects a certain feeling that the formula they've been using, or the procedures they have been using, seem to work, and to reduce it to that strict a formula might lead to the same kinds of problems that Amendment 1 has led to, and which is reflected in 17 counties had so-called debrucing measures. 13 of them passed.
And is it that the residents of Colorado are saying we didn't know what we were voting for 3 years ago, or are they just...
I think that's part of it. I don't think the idea that revenue would be limited was very widely circulated among voters. They knew that Amendment 1 had something to do with voting on new taxes, but I don't think they realized that it meant that government jurisdictions would have to return money they collected with existing taxes. And to a lot of people that seems, well, isn't that a little unfair?
Mike Booth.
I think that also comes down to what happens on the national level when people say, I hate taxes, I'm really tired of paying new taxes. In fact, let's cut the whole budget. And they say, okay, well, do you want to cut national parks? And they say, well, no, we don't want to cut that, so keep that money. Do you want to cut welfare? And they say, well, not too much, so why don't you keep that money? And the same thing goes on with these Amendment 1 issues. When people say, okay, do you want RTD to give back the money and therefore stop increasing bus service in a time of high growth in Colorado? And they say, no, we would like you to keep that money and use it the way that you think is the most important.
Two aspects of traffic. Fred Brown, briefly, Aspen voters said no to a wider airport runway.
I think it's a difficult problem for them to deal with the idea of 737s coming into that narrow valley and taking off over the town. You know, it's not a very, there's not a lot of room there, and not only that, it would bring in a lot more people and would crowd an already crowded situation.
And growth on rubber tires, particularly along the Front Range, the 2 million people who seem each to have one or two or more cars. Guy Kelly, it's getting tougher and tougher to get from here to there.
Yeah, it's a bumper-to-bumper, horn-honking hassle to get anywhere in the metro area. And I think that was reflected in the RTD debrucing vote. People said, if we can help transportation in this area by allowing the bus company to keep some of this money that they would have gotten, they're getting anyway without a tax increase, go ahead. We're tired. That's where growth affects people's personal lives on a daily basis when they drive to and from work or go out. It's really gotten bad, very congested, and it's probably, it's reaching a critical mass, and people want something done about it.
And as statistics project now, in the next 4 or 5 years, we'll have another 250,000 people along the Front Range. Each will have a car.
That's a city about the size of Aurora, and that probably will happen by 2000 or so, and statewide we'll have another 708,000 by 2000, according to some forecasts. It'll put us over 4 million. So things aren't going to change, and maybe these growth issues on the ballot are going to be permanent fixtures here over the next few years.
Rush hour is getting longer and longer, and particularly along I-25, it's slower going both directions, morning and night.
It's almost even going both ways, which isn't the tradition at rush hour. It's usually heaviest one way in the morning and the other at night. But you've got traffic at I-25 and 6th Avenue where they actually do vehicle counts breaking records every month. It's about 500,000 vehicle trips ahead of last year's record pace. So it's packed on the highway.
Fred Brown?
You know, Guy, I think one of the reasons that people voted for RTD doesn't really bode that well for traffic generally, and that is I think that they felt that if more people would take the bus, then the traffic would be, or the roads would be a little bit more open for them to drive on.
Yeah, and about 5% of the people in the metro area ride the bus. 100% pay taxes. And people like the idea of mass transportation, but it sure is a lot more convenient to get into your own car by yourself and drive to and from work or wherever you want to go. So there is sort of a contradiction there.
Mike Booth.
I just think it's interesting that even in this era of anti-tax sentiment, I think people are emboldened enough by all these concerns about growth that now we have people at the state level. The governor just appointed a Blue Ribbon Commission on transportation, and they're specifically talking about raising gasoline taxes on everybody who drives, the people that Guy is talking about, in order to fund between $200 and $600 million a year in new road projects and transit projects. And I think that's the key, is that they don't just want to add lanes to the highways, they want to give some of that money to agencies like RTD or commuter rail, places that will take more of those cars off the road.
This $200 to $600 million may be on next year's ballot.
That's what they're talking about. There was a private group that had been meeting for the last year or two talking about the need for more transportation spending, and Governor Romer has been saying all around the state in his growth conferences that there's about $8 billion in unfunded necessary highway projects over the next 10 to 20 years, and so this would help close some of that gap.
And to Debbie Frazier.
Do you sense any kind of either political will or popular will to put the kind of money that we're putting into airports and baseball stadiums into some kind of major mass transit? I know we've been in sort of withdrawal shock for years because there are no federal funds for this.
One thing that Ben Klein said yesterday when he was so happy about the RTD vote was that this is the first vote that RTD has won since 1974, was the way he put it. They've lost elections in between now and back then about whether to build light rail around the metro area. I think that's still very unclear whether people are willing to do that. If they come forward with a $200 to $600 million tax proposal that says, we'll build a lot more roads and make your morning commute a lot easier, seems like a lot of people would be willing to go for that. If they start talking about $100 million for one single light rail spur into one part of the metro area, and that money is sucked into that, then I don't know, people might start changing their minds pretty quickly. That's a tough question.
Mike Booth, stay with you for just a moment. Different topics. Actually, it's an election issue of 3 years ago. Kevin Thibodeau was the founder of Colorado Family Values Organization, and now he says they just aren't going the right direction.
Kevin was the fire behind Amendment 2 in a lot of ways. A political organizer, spent a lot of time on his feet